Hello, Dr. Austin Lim. It's so great to have you here with us today.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me today.
I'm very excited to be diving into all things neuroscience and the brain, including your new book, Horror on the Brain, which I have personally devoured. Before we get going with the questions, I was wondering if you could just quickly introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what it is you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Austin Lim. As you said, I'm an associate teaching professor at DePaul University in Chicago. And as a teaching professor, I'm responsible for running some of the classes in the neuroscience department. I teach kind of a broad range of courses, including a non-majors class, some introductory level classes, as well as some upper level lab courses and a grad student course in biopsychology.
And is this an expansive range of topics that you cover in your day-to-day working life? But this book specifically focuses on the horror side of things. So why do you love horror?
I think with horror media, there's something really special about being able to explore a thrill from the safety of your own home. As essentially a lot of media, it really comes down to escapism in a way, right? Where the same reason why people like me, for instance, love playing video games. We immerse ourselves in those universes. We get to feel stuff that we don't always get in our everyday lives. You know, we meet some interesting people. It's just really fun to kind of get away and think through, imagine what it would be like if I was in this scary situation. But at the same time, I could always just put the book down and go do something else and sort of put it to the back of my mind. And there's sort of that joy that you get, or that I get, from exploring something safely.
Yeah, I remember speaking with some of the team over the Recreational Fear Lab, and they were saying about how most people have some enjoyment of safely exploring fear, but everyone has kind of different limits. And I think for me, that comes in with like horror gaming, where I remember trying to play The Last of Us 2, and my performance just dropped out because I got so frightened by all of the jump scares.
That's a funny thing about horror gaming is, I was kind of into horror peripherally when I was little, and then at some point I played Silent Hill, and it was just so scary that I just, put it off completely. I was like, no more horror for a while. Let me just dig into nonfiction reading, and I'll just stick with that for a little bit. And it's only kind of relatively recently that I kind of got back into that stuff. So yeah, I feel that.
Well, thank goodness you did, because it enabled you to put together this fantastic book. And I mean, one of the things I kind of love about it is that at times it almost feels like a bit of a magician's guide. It sort of like reveals some of the real or occasionally speculative neurological mechanisms that can or could explain some of the themes and storylines explored in popular horror. Why did you want to write it?
What I wanted to focus on quite a bit was how there's actually a lot of overlap between the worlds of creativity and in science. And I don't know if this is real, or it might just be a perceived thing that I have going on, but I just imagine that the two things are often depicted as, like two sides of a coin, right? Where you're either a creative type or you're a scientific type. But, we all know that there's really a spectrum, and the creativity lies on one end, scientific thought and processes lie on the other end, but there's a whole range of really interesting stuff right in the middle. One example that I often think about with why creativity is so valuable in science is the story behind this new technique called expansion microscopy. It's one of those things in neuroscience where you're trying to look at things that are just too small and you can't use light to see it, so normal microscopy strategies don't work. But somebody had the idea, well, if we can't see the things, why don't we just make the things larger? It's a really weird idea, but it's developed into this whole strategy where you can inject one of the materials that's found in diapers because of its ability to expand, and you just inject that into the cellular or around the cellular material, and it just makes stuff bigger, which makes it easier to see. And it's just a really weird example of how, some scientist was just thinking really far outside of the box, and that's how they came up with this technique.
And what do you hope that people are going to take away from reading your book?
I would love it if one of the readers look at some of these case studies or some of these stories and develop a work of fiction based on what was described here in the clinical literature. I just really want to instill both the sense of, curiosity and creativity in the reader more than anything. If someone would see one of these case studies and say, that character would make an amazing detective, or that character would be a super interesting haunted character who's followed around by the sensation of ghosts or something like that. If anyone comes up with a piece of dystopian fiction based on something they see in my story, please share it with me. I would love to read it. It would make me so happy to see that I was able to inspire some creativity in someone.
Yeah, I can totally imagine that happening because some of the examples you do present, like, they really are stranger than fiction. They're real life things, but we'll get on to more of those later. I feel like a good place to start is with what horror does to us. So can you talk us through some of the sort of cascade of processes and stations in the brain that kick in when we experience something frightening?
What's so interesting about that question is that, fear is probably the oldest emotion, right? It's primitive, it's prehistoric, it's evolutionary. We're talking about the time scale here. And yet there's still debate about how it all functions and what's going on with it, which is really, really fun. There's kind of two things that are happening, and this is kind of one of the origins of the big debates about it, which is happening first, or which causes which. You get those physiological changes that happens when we come across or when we think about something scary. So, our heart rate goes up, our lungs become more effective at taking in oxygen, we start sweating, all of those things are happening to our body. But then at the same time, or simultaneously, or before or after, kind of depending on which theory you're leaning towards, there's also a higher order thought process that's going on. And these higher order thought process are sort of like this appraisal process, determining, is this thing that I'm engaging with actually a threat to my well-being, or is it all just, in my head? Or maybe something like, I'm going to suppress showing this fear response because I'm trying to impress someone. But sort of at its core, the fear response is mostly driven by the HPA axis, which stands for the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal glands axis. And it's just sort of this chain of signaling that originates in the brain and trickles down to the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys. And the adrenal glands are the ones that are responsible for pumping out that neurohormone that causes all those physiological changes. Even upstream from the HPA axis, the hypothalamus gets really strong inputs from the amygdala. And the amygdala is another one of those older brain structures that also incorporates signals from those higher circuits. So the cortex is sending signals to the amygdala, which is where you're starting to get that appraisal, suppression of fear response sort of signals. And it kind of all gets integrated right there before that communicates down through the rest of our body. Norepinephrine is, they call the physiological changes, classically it's called fight or flight, but I much prefer the phrase battle or skedaddle. I've been using that a lot more so than fight or flight.
Definitely superior. I'm going to be stealing that for sure. I do think as well that kind of the things you were mentioning there, it goes to show you kind of like the power of the mind that I'm always blown away by, because I've been reading something recently that where it was talking about how one of the issues in like things like anxiety and stuff like that is that you are sort of activating these same parts of the brain through a kind of imagined fear, this thing that you're worrying about, and that actually there are ways that you can sort of talk yourself down from, triggering that fear response over, a presentation or something that you're scared about that isn't really going to kill you the same way that a bear might, but you still feel that kind of heart racing, sweating, all those things you mentioned. But you raised the really interesting case of patient SM. So I was wondering if you could sort of tell us what was unique about this person and what it could teach us about fear.
Sure, yeah. So patient SM was a rare case study. She was born with an extremely unusual condition called Urbach-Wiethe disorder. Essentially what happens is over the course of early life to early adulthood, there's a progressive destruction of her amygdala. As the disease progresses, they've done these MRI scans of patient SM's brain, and you see these giant gaping holes where her amygdala would be. What's so interesting about the disease and what makes it such a cool case study is that it's very, very specific. The neurodegeneration you see is just in the amygdala. Everything else is largely intact, which means her intelligence fell totally within the normal bell curve. Behavioral responding for most things is perfectly normal, with the one exception of the sense of fear. When the amygdala is destroyed, it's only the sense of fear that was lost. What was so cool about the studies that were done with patient SM was they asked her to rate a bunch of different emotionally charged videos. So they showed her a whole bunch of different clips from famous scary movies. So they showed her some scenes from Seven, from Arachnophobia, from The Ring, scenes that for most people would cause that physiological change and a sense of fear. But she reported having no fear at all in all of those circumstances. What's really interesting with her is that all of the other emotions were totally intact, right? She could recognize that, children laughing is happiness. She could recognize that children and adults who are starving is sad. So all the other emotional processing is intact. It just happens to be fear that's lacking in her responding. And those movies are one circumstance, right? Because that's something that people voluntarily seek out sometimes. So they actually asked her about real life instances where she would have experienced fear, but she didn't. Or the researchers, through interviews, dug up an instance in her life, which was dubbed the knife incident, when she was put in genuine danger. There was a stranger who put a knife to her neck and threatened to cut her. And she reported having no fear in that instance. She reported walking home after that happened, and then she reported walking past that exact same spot the next day. And when you think about an avoidance mechanism as a tool to prevent getting put into those kind of situations again in the future, and she showed none of those signs.
Yeah, that's one of the things I always find incredible with the brain, the idea that, these very specific changes come up with these such specific symptoms, but the person is still functional. To my mind, as someone who isn't a neuroscientist, I would have thought, well, if the amygdala are gone, you're just going to shut down. But it has this incredible ability to keep on going almost perfectly, apart from this one really crucial difference. It's just fascinating. You also mention a few concepts that horror authors have used to haunting effect in some of the best, books and movies. I'd love to touch on a couple of them. I mean, to kick off, what are liminal spaces?
Yeah, a liminal space is an empty place where you expect to see a lot of activity, a lot of foot traffic, a lot of people, other signs of life. I think the best example of this, if your flight has ever been delayed and you're walking around a completely deserted airport and all these other people are just, minding their own business, trying to get on with the rest of their lives, where you normally expect to see airports full of activity, a lot of movement, a lot of people, a lot of life, but instead it's just a little bit darker and it's just deserted. It's just really kind of puts you on edge a little bit. It's not as profound as some of the other fears that we might experience, right? But it's still a very deep and kind of unsettling sensation. I think The Shining is a perfect cinematic example of what a liminal space looks and feels like. You're in an empty hotel, you're going through these back hallways, you're going through a claustrophobic hedge maze, all of these little places where you expect to see activity, and there's just nothing there. I actually recently submitted a grant to try to study how we can better utilize a liminal space in the context of public service announcements. This is one of those collaborative grants which I put together with some people from the business school and from the marketing program to try to figure out if you can use liminal imagery to better convey a message, or to more effectively convey a message, as opposed to those explicitly fear-driven messages. So we'll see what happens with that grant.
One of the liminal spaces I remember you mentioned, which I felt very much, I'm sure a lot of people will, was the example of seeing re places that were normally really crowded, and then when the COVID-19 lockdowns kicked in, to see them empty. And then it made me think, well, that's exactly what they did with 28 Days Later, wasn't it? That incredible scene of Cillian Murphy walking around by himself was really haunting. So they really is an effective tool.
Yeah, I think those post-apocalyptic universes they really play into that liminal sensation, right? You've got all these empty hallways, empty malls, for instance. They really use that liminal sensation.
Another great one that you bring up is the Uncanny Valley. So what can you tell us about that?
It's essentially when we see something that's almost human, but not quite. It's called this valley because we have a dip in our affinity towards that thing, right? And we think about our affinity towards stuff rises to a certain degree, but when it gets a little bit too close to being human, but not quite, there's something about it that's really creepy and kind of unsettling. And this was, I think, super effectively used by the people who made Megan. It's essentially about a robot girl who's, it's a kind of a classic slasher flick, where there's just something really weird about the way she responds and the way she moves and behaves. It's nearly human, but not quite. What's so cool about the Uncanny Valley is that it can be used to create that sense of horror if you want it to. When you don't want to create horror, you're really trying to stay away from the Uncanny Valley. And there's a lot of really cool examples about test audiences who are watching animated things and they're saying, no, I really dislike the way that character looks. They look a little too human. I guess the fairly famous ones is Sonic the Hedgehog. The original design for Sonic was demolished all across the internet. They said, oh, there's something weird about the proportions of his eyes to his nose. There's a little too much fur right around that little snout area. Like, whenever he opened his mouth, his teeth looked too human. Like, you can see the little ridges in it. It's just a little bit weird. And so after, it got destroyed on the internet, the animators went back and said, this is right in the Uncanny Valley, and we don't want that. So let's dial him back. Let's make him less human, more cartoony. They made his eyes giant. They took away the details in the teeth, so then it's just sort of this blob kind of situation. And, they fixed all those things because they wanted to appeal rather than to terrify.
There's actually really good timing as well, because I got sent a study this morning about a new kind of Android where they're trying to incorporate a thinking face. Because I think you mentioned one of the problems is when you're speaking to a kind of AI, the brief pause before they respond. And with a human, that happens a lot, but you furrow your brow and you show kind of obvious signs that you're thinking. And another one that I enjoyed was your exploration of memory and how it can be kind of influenced and possibly deleted. We can get onto that later. But yeah, what can you tell us about kind of memory?
From an evolutionary perspective, the idea or the function behind memory wasn't to create a perfect replication of our surroundings. That would just take up way too much cognitive deficit, so much cognitive space, so much energy to maintain a perfect memory of our surroundings. And it's just not what we have come to be through evolution. You don't need the full picture. You just need to focus on a few things at a time. So something like, red berries yummy and green berries yucky. That's kind of the cognitive shortcut that our memory is really meant for. So yeah, we're just really not great at remembering things for the most part.
And you mentioned earlier about how, science actually it is creative. And I definitely think it feels creative the way that you've approached some topics, and you've kind of started at the end with the plot put forward by a film or a book, and then you've worked backwards to sort of be, well, this could be, the neuroscience mechanisms behind that. I particularly loved your An Unethical Guide to Erasing Joel Barish's Memories of Clementine Krasinski based on speculative biotechnology that has never been tested on humans, to tackle what had occurred in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. I mean, how difficult was that for you to kind of piece that together?
That's kind of the technology that I had thought about quite a bit working in my postdoc using not exactly those tools, but a lot of those, some of the genetic modification tools. I had been working with that stuff in during my postdoc. So it was just the next little step about the memory stuff was what I needed to research about to make that section kind of come together.
It was fascinating to explore. And I mean, I love that way of thinking about things. But that said, obviously a lot of these horror things, it's fiction, so it can play with the parameters of what's realistic. For yourself, how important do you think it is for fictional tales to try and adhere to a kind of semi-legit science? Do you, as a neuroscientist and lover of horror, think that it can improve a story?
I go back and forth on this pretty much with every story that I read. Sometimes I'm able to fully suspend the scientific stuff and just kind of roll with it. Some days I really appreciate when it's obvious that the researcher had done a bunch of the basic physical and scientific research. I think the one of the big examples that I can think of is Andy Weir, the guy who wrote The Martian, and I just read Project Hail Mary not too long ago. And, the principles of spaceflight and physics are, it's like completely a mystery how anyone can do that stuff. I can appreciate the work that went into digging into that side of it and how all of those elements were brought in to his works. When it comes to all the brain stuff and the biology, the kind of basis in real science does add a little bit because it feels like it's the extension. It's like the what if. There's a lot of what ifs when you're coming up with those new experiments. It's like, what if the brain or the body works in this way? If that's true, then my next experiment will be successful. It does feel like a natural extension of what science is doing. It's like, what if society had access to mind erasing technology or memory deleting technology? What would that society look like? It's kind of just taking the tiny things we do in science and turning it into a bigger scale, which I really appreciate, and that's really fun. But at the same time, right, there's all kinds of phenomena that we have no tools to reasonably measure or accurately measure yet. So that's also pretty fun too.
I always remember in a Mega Shark versus Giant Octopus, not a documentary, and they're trying to make pheromones, and when they finally get the right recipe, the thing glows, and it's like, I don't know much about pheromones, but I'm pretty sure they don't glow. But I mean, I love it. Just run with it. Another kind of cheat, if you would call it that I've always loved, is that there's this sort of agreed upon thing to call precious resources that are hard to acquire unobtainium. I've seen this in a few things. I was wondering if you've come across any other kind of workarounds like that in horror or sci-fi.
I like psychological horror the best. It's sort of my favorite genre, in addition to cosmic horror. A lot of that plays with ambiguity quite a bit. It leaves a lot of questions at the end, whether what actually happened was some manifestation of a supernatural thing, or was it all just in a person's head? And I think this is such a useful tool from kind of the marketing perspective, because it keeps people talking about it, right? There's all kinds of, video essays on YouTube about whether the horrors in blank 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 were real or not, and I think that's really fun. It kind of has a long, the ambiguity has a long history in horror literature from the way I see it. When you think about The Turn of the Screw, which is this really relatively old, it's Victorian era style writing from the late 1800s. It at the end, there's all these things that might be happening to the protagonist, but then again, it could all be written off as, no, none of this is real. There aren't any ghosts. It's just a person who's dealing with their past experiences. So, yeah, I just love the ambiguity and the vagueness in horror. I think it's a useful tool.
Yeah, I think that's definitely very effective because if you have a storyline and it's like, it was ghosts, I feel like that stays with me less than thinking, well, this could potentially happen to me if I went through the right sequence of stressful events. I could start seeing this as well. So I definitely think that would make for a frightening story. And I mentioned earlier that, a lot of the the case studies you mentioned, they do sound stranger than fiction because of how specific the changes are, from different kinds of injuries or developmental changes. Could you tell us perhaps about one of the stranger conditions you've come across during your research?
There's all kinds of very unusual things that happen to people for question mark reasons. One that is sticking in my head at the moment is a thing called prosopometamorphopsia, which is this exceedingly rarely diagnosed condition. It's essentially a person sees other people's faces progressively transform into other face-like things. So one of the case studies that was described by Oliver Sacks, who is maybe one of my top favorite science writers of all time, he describes a case where a woman would look at someone's face for long enough and she would see that face morph into the face of a dragon. Like their skin would change colors. A lot of times it would turn into shades of purple. Their skin would start developing scales. Their ears would get a little bit pointier. All sorts of unusual perceptual changes. I think that one's pretty unusual. They would make for a really fascinating character in any kind of media, I think.
I mean, this is kind of stuff that I found, every page you turn of your book, there's just these endless cool facts and things that I had not come across before. I mean, do you have a favorite fact that you unearthed while you were writing it?
A fact about an actual neuroanatomist, Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He was a Spanish neuroanatomist, and he was one of the first people who scientifically looked at the nervous system under the microscope. So he was responsible for developing the neuron doctrine, the idea that neurons are separate cells that communicate to each other across a gap. He didn't have the tools to fully prove this, but he theorized that. And for all the work that he did, he got a Nobel Prize for it. Okay, but before he did all that stuff with the microscopy, I learned that he was actually a competitive bodybuilder. So in his biography, there are these images of him, without his shirt, his muscles just, bulging everywhere. And he has this like glorious mustache from the late 1800s. Very sharp, very well groomed. It's just a fun little fact about, scientists can have interests other than, brain cells. They can do other things and they can be passionate about other stuff too.
And I mean, I appreciate that with this book, you're approaching horror from the perspective of a neuroscientist. So it's not about, being a writing coach. But given what you've learned, what would your suggestions be to kind of aspiring authors or filmmakers who might be considering tackling some of the themes that you explore?
I would say it's kind of a thing that I mentioned before, but definitely look for inspiration in the weirdest places, right? There's these case studies in the clinical literature. There's inspiration to be found anywhere. And I think that just having a little nugget of a story that you're interested in, if it's so deeply interesting to you, you can spin that off into so many cool areas. The other thing that I really appreciate are novel takes on things, I guess. So in a lot of the horror literature, there's kind of this underlying trope or a theme of trauma, right? And we know for sure that trauma can predispose people to a variety of mental illnesses later in the future. But I really like when somebody pulls in some little twist based on that seed. So the example I can think of with respect to that twist is Jordan Peele's Get Out. It's essentially about a black man who has grown up with decades of racial trauma. And there's a little twist at the end that kind of, or, near the end, that really changes our sense of what that could mean. So I think there's, adding something a little bit above and beyond is what really gets me into this kind of stuff.
The themes that you explore in the book, they kind of bounce between, the strange, complex, you've got some really funny stories in there, and also some really serious stuff that you cover. So it's quite difficult to achieve that balance of, keeping it entertaining and engaging while going through some heavy things. I mean, would you have any advice for anyone who's thinking about penning a non-fiction book and wants to aim for something that's similarly accessible and engaging?
In my experience, what I think has helped me was to start small. So when I was a postdoc, I started getting interested in the realms of science communication. So I started reaching out to these smaller venues, some science communication blogs, some organizations, just saying, I wanna write some essays. Here's a sample of my writing. What are your thoughts from there? These organizations that I had worked with, I was lucky because there were editors who were willing to help contribute to the, I guess, my interest in science communication by providing their services for free. And so I was able to get an extra pair of eyes, some other people who could give me feedback on my writing. And that, I think, really gave me some really valuable experience. They're just short blog posts, but that was just a new way to get into that world. Don't be afraid to let your personality show in that writing. So if you're a trained scientist, you've basically been conditioned or trained to eliminate like all traces of personality. Like even the most interesting scientific discoveries are just like rendered into the most dry instruction manuals. It's amazing how little personality there is in these really cool findings. So the neat thing about science communication is that you get to talk to people at the level that they're at, which is they want to hear some interesting stuff. They want to hear a story being told, not from the dry scientific perspective, but from the perspective of anyone who enjoys stories.
Yeah, I definitely remember making that transition myself, like when I was studying zoology at university, and we were even being told by some of our like professors to use symbols instead of words. That's how concise they wanted it down to. And then I decided I wanted to be a journalist, and I was like, right, I've got to learn how to speak English again. But it does, I think, like you say, it frees you up so much because I always like to think of like the way that I write now with IFL Science is I try and word it in the same way that I would if I was telling it to my friend at the pub kind of thing. And you realize then actually how much crossover there is between fiction and non-fiction writing, because it's still about, presenting the facts and, hiding little bits to the end, and you can give it a bit of flair. It's really good fun. We've checked off a lot of recommendations. There are hundreds in the book, and we've done a few here today. If I could be really mean and push you, do you have a favorite horror from film or books?
Yeah, that is a super tough question. I do have some favorites, absolute favorites that I go back to over and over again. One of my total favorites is The Haunting of Hill House, which is on Netflix. I think it's 10 episodes, so it's a little bit of a time investment. It's directed by Mike Flanagan, who has done a bunch of really great scary things, but I think this is kind of peak horror. The other thing that I'm super into is The Last of Us, so I'm glad you mentioned it. I have a copy of The Last of Us 2, which my wife got for me for my birthday like 4 years ago, and I haven't played it yet, and I feel really bad about it. But I love the original Last of Us, and the video game and the HBO adaptation. I think it's the best take on the whole zombie thing, the post-apocalyptic zombie thing, because it combines more than just the scary horror imagery. It is also an amazing drama. People, or at least I get into it at the emotional level that makes it so much more than just a scary thing. As far as science fiction, Inception for sure. Christopher Nolan and his whole body of work I'm super into as well. So he did Memento, which is this awesome story about what real life insomnia looks like.
The Haunting of Hill House, I'm ashamed to say I think I've watched it like 3, possibly 4 times over. Still, I start out, watching it to be scared, and then by the end I'm crying. And then that was the same thing with The Last of Us. I remember I was like, can't wait for all these jump scares. And then I was like, why am I weeping? It's so moving. It's incredible.
Yeah, I can definitely remember it's 3 specific moments in The Last of Us, and spoiler free, 3 specific moments where I was like, I am crying too much. I need to put down the controller, walk away for a little bit, let this sink in. I can't play this anymore right now. It's so emotionally powerful. And yeah, I watch The Haunting of Hill House every October, so I'm up there with you.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Austin Lim. It's been such a fascinating glimpse into horror on the brain and the neuroscience of fear. I feel fairly confident that this will spark some new science fiction and horror. So look forward to hopefully hearing from anyone about that. And it's been great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Thank you for your time.